Welcome to the Immigration Quagmire Part 2 with Kathleen Walker, because there are few topics that are as volatile as immigration, and we're going to continue the discussion about how is the system broken, what are the issues that are being faced, what's the morally correct thing to do, and Kathleen Walker, who is our international expert on this issue, is going to help us out. Welcome again, Kathleen.
Thanks a lot, Holly. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And so just continuing the discussion that we began at the last show, and that is the whole, from a business owner's perspective. Let's say you're a business owner. Could be a corporation, could be an individual. What are some of the key issues that those individuals are facing, frustrations related to immigration?
Well, it's funny. Every employer really has a part in the immigration enforcement plan of the government. And back in 1986, they passed this thing called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. A part of it, to get through the legalization program they had back then, was to say employers were going to be responsible for trying to reduce the magnet of jobs to undocumented workers. So employers had at their feet the responsibility presented of, you're supposed to figure out if your applicant for the job that you decide to hire is work authorized or not. And that opened an era, of the employer having to basically figure out what these documents represent when somebody presents information about their work eligibility. You have to complete this thing called an I-9 form. Most people know about a W-2. But over 25 years later, I still have some employers who do not know that they have this responsibility of figuring out work eligibility and completing this form. The Obama administration, contrary to the Bush administration, has focused its energy on audits of employers. And you can have substantial penalties and even criminal exposure if you fail to get this job right.
So now employers are actually in the immigration enforcement business?
Believe it or not, yes, they have been totally drug into the deal.
Yeah. And so are there actually a lot of cases surrounding this issue, or is it relatively small?
No, in proportion to the number of employers we have in the United States, it's small as far as the number of employers that have actually been penalized or management actually being subjected to criminal violations. But there are more and more resources being devoted to these enforcement actions. So for your one-page I-9 form, you can be exposed to, just on civil penalties, $1,100 a pop.
Wow.
And that can add up pretty quick.
Yeah, especially if you're hiring a lot of people, absolutely.
And the government has provided over a 60-page handbook to be able to figure out how to complete the one-page form.
Isn't that typical? Oh my gosh.
And in addition to that, there's a totally new website called I-9 Central as well, with additional helpful tidbits on how to complete the form in addition to the 60-page handbook.
So this is an additional cost, an additional burden, an additional personnel requirement that is now on a business of any size?
Yes. In fact, I just recently finished one particular audit where we had a restaurant chain that ended up having to shut down multiple locations because employees failed to show up to work when they heard that this I-9 audit was starting. And what that means to an employer typically is that, well, wait a minute, I may have undocumented workers. And so even though an employer may fill out the form properly, they could still be exposed to penalty if they get a notice later on saying from the government, we don't think that John Doe is really John Doe, or this particular work authorization document never was even issued. And that happens quite frequently.
Why do you think that the Obama administration has, what was the Bush administration doing, first of all, and then why would the Obama administration do it differently?
I think, you know, the political message was, we're going to focus on employers, not the employees as much. Under the Bush administration, you would have something called, they called them raids way back when.
Yeah.
The terminology they prefer more is like an enforcement action.
Yes.
But basically your work site might be surrounded one day by various immigration customs enforcement officials, and people are fleeing. and people are being picked up, and from one day to the next, your business basically is shut down because you've lost the workforce. In the agricultural industry alone, typically over 95% of the workforce is allegedly undocumented.
Mm-hmm.
So you can basically shut down businesses very quickly. The Obama administration moved the enforcement efforts more to, let's find egregious employers and try to make a statement by fining them. And so more notices of inspection looking at documents than the raid.
Going after the individuals.
The raid.
So which is better, or are both of them not good, or what's the answer here?
Well, the answer is first making the one-page form easier to complete.
Mm-hmm.
I should not need 60 pages plus an additional website to figure out how to fill out a one-page form.
That's just a basic.
Yeah, I'm thinking that should be easier.
Yeah.
And other than that, we need to shut down fraudulent document rings. And unfortunately, there are a lot of them. But employers who fill out the form in good faith
Yeah.
should not be subject to these fines, in my
Right.
opinion.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So those would be two proactive ways that would not necessarily harm business, and at the same time wouldn't frighten people who may not be doing something illegal.
I think that in addition to that, part of this answer is resolving our comprehensive immigration reform problem.
Mm-hmm.
If we have legitimate labor needs, then an employer should be able to fill them. And there are indeed areas of our country in which we do not have available employees, high-skilled as well as low-skilled positions.
Mm-hmm.
If we can get some agreement on that and figure out a way to fill those needs in an effective way, I think we're going to be a lot more competitive globally.
And I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, wait a minute, our unemployment rate is at 15 to 18%, and we can't find people to fill those jobs. Can you help us to understand that dynamic? How can we have such high unemployment, but yet not enough skilled or workers in general to fill those jobs?
Okay.
It seems like a paradox there.
Here in El Paso, do you think we have enough physicians?
No, I know we don't.
Nurses?
Probably not.
I can tell you that in Kansas, in the dairy industry or poultry processing plants or beef processing plants, that they have areas of very high employment, and they can advertise from now until the cows come home, no pun intended, and find no workers.
Mm-hmm.
So if we really care about our agricultural industry or about many of our higher skilled positions, we need to recognize that we still have legitimate labor needs. And for the immigration categories I'm talking about, many of them, especially for immigrant visas, which means gaining permanent residence, you have to test the labor market. You have to show that you have tried to hire U.S. workers, those that are authorized to work in the U.S. If I establish that I have a legitimate labor need, then I can wait. I'll just for fun show you today. Here's our visa bulletin that tells me how long I have to wait. Right now, for an unskilled worker from Mexico, I'm going to wait easily over 10 years.
So if you have a job that you can prove legitimately you've tried to hire a worker here, a U.S. citizen, you've been able to find no one, they want you to wait 10 years so you can bring that worker from Mexico.
To fill my labor need that I've got right now.
Yeah. So, and of course, that makes no sense.
Well, yeah, I'm in total agreement.
Yeah, right. And why is that? Why would the wait be so long? What's going on there that creates idiocy like that?
I didn't say that.
You didn't say it, I did.
No, but I'm not going to disagree. Because we have a system where we only have a certain number of visas available for employment-based petitions every year.
I see.
Once we hit that cap, then we've got people in the waiting line. So these waits are based on historic waits, and we don't change the numbers tied to the exhibited labor need.
Right.
They just stay static.
Right.
So there's no flexibility to address economic need.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. So it's a certain number of slots, and once you hit that number of slots, it's
You
go.
got your ticket in
Yeah.
the waiting line.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
That's it.
And that makes no sense whatsoever.
And in the meantime, the person typically has no ability to perform any services.
Right.
So you're
So they end up hiring illegally or taking their business elsewhere.
they get desperate enough. Desperate situations cause desperate actions,
Mm-hmm.
and you, in some cases, end up with people just taking whatever they can get.
Yeah, right. So that's the catch-22 that
Totally.
people talk about related to immigration and the bad part, that it's not just all about people coming over the borders at midnight.
No, I'm talking about the
yeah.
legitimate system
Yeah.
and how it works, and you end up in this line to nowhere.
Yeah, and so that's definitely not a good thing. Can you tell me the whole process of someone who's trying to choose? I want to get to the United States, and I can sneak in and live kind of a in the shadows lifestyle, or I can stay in my country and wait 10, 20 years for legal immigration status. Is there actually
Middle ground?
a middle ground there?
If you could qualify for something called a non-immigrant visa, we have a bunch of different categories. It's an alphabet soup. Different options for people who want to work in the United States. These categories are normally focused on people who have at least a bachelor's degree or higher. In the unskilled area, we have two categories people use typically. One is called the H-2A category for agricultural workers, and the other one is H-2B for skilled workers. The problem is that the H-2Bs, not enough numbers to fill the need. On the H-2As, complaints regarding the complexity of the process, difficulties in being able to recruit people, and so the H-2A has really not been well utilized because people just have a hard time complying with the specificities of the regulations.
And so there is that middle ground, but
Limited.
It's a very limited amount, and so hence the whole problem with illegal or undocumented, again, trying to fill a labor need that may be there.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. What's been the impact of the border fence? Are you a fan of the border fence or not? What have been the pluses and minuses of that?
Oh God, that's a hard one.
Yeah.
I think that the border fence has helped Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol to a degree to be able to divert their attention to certain locations, to reduce the focus on interdiction to certain areas. And I can see from an enforcement perspective that will help me allocate my resources better. There are plenty of great quotes out there about if I build a 40-foot fence, I'll have a 40-foot ladder, or I'll have a tunnel, or whatever. It is not a panacea to the issue of illegal entry. And we have a large issue related to people coming in legally, and then, as we talked about earlier on the other segment, overstaying or working without authorization. It is an element within a border security plan, but until we have the political gumption to also address legal mechanisms, we're really not fully addressing the border security question.
Yeah, and so all of the problems that you've pointed out of the bottlenecks in the system and so forth, where we would probably reduce the number of quote-unquote illegal or undocumented dramatically if some of these mechanisms were in place. Yeah.
Agreed.
So what are some of the major frustrations that you have as an attorney working in this area?
From a government perspective, often communications with the government are difficult. And being able to then hope that the government is reviewing the information under current guidance when they don't necessarily get clued in on changes that have occurred timely. So it can be a definite lesson in frustration, diplomacy, not losing your mind, in trying to say, but wait, you know, this policy has been modified. Here are the facts. Have you reviewed this? In addition to that, if I'm trying to gain access to the facts, the use of the Freedom of Information Act to try to gain information about history is an art form, and it is extremely difficult. In the commuter lane we have here in El Paso, we often have people who are kicked out for security concerns. Trying to find out why the government feels that your client has a security issue is extremely difficult. So how would you like, as a U.S. citizen, to be accused of being a security risk without being able to face and address your accuser?
So is the whole immigration enforcement thing, it really is a policing function, but is it subject to the same civil rights laws and all of that sort of thing that everything else is, or is it a separate country unto itself?
Well, probably the latter.
Yeah.
But in the context of when you're, let me see if I've got it right.
Yeah.
At a port of entry, when I present myself for admission to the United States, my rights are more limited because they, meaning Customs and Border Protection, have to assess whether or not I'm legally entitled to enter the United States. When we get away from the ports of entry, and that's where you get into questions about, wait a minute, I don't know if you remember several years ago, the county was accused of allegedly trying to enforce immigration laws against county residents by having stops outside of schools, etc. And Arizona, of course, under Senate Bill 1070 that they passed, and that has been held constitutional to a degree on certain counts, but it's still subject to federal litigation. It seems to be very much an interest in local law enforcement being forced into becoming immigration enforcers. And the issue of preemption is being argued continually in the immigration field. Why should we utilize local resources to interdict somebody who is subject to a civil immigration violation? Not criminal, but civil. That thing about being an overstay, working without authorization, civil violation subjects me to being kicked out of the country. Not the same thing as I stole something and I'm going to be in county jail for theft.
Right.
Totally different.
Is this the basic issue with some of the things that have gone on in Arizona related to law enforcement enforcing immigration status, whether you're an illegal? Is that where that comes from?
That's a part of that. And
can you help us understand that a little more?
One of the most offensive things that I found and that did not go through was that at one point they were saying that if I was on public property and I did not have, for example, my permanent resident card, it's actually a misdemeanor if I'm a permanent resident of the United States and I fail to have that document on me. Now, nobody really enforces that, but what Arizona was going to do is say that if I'm at a public pool, let's say, and you don't have your permanent resident card with you, you're going to be subject to a trespass violation, and they're going to put you in jail because of it. Now, fortunately, that did not go through. The other part of the equation, though, that's still around is this concern about if I have violated my immigration status, if I get stopped on a regular kind of stop, like I have a broken taillight or ran a red light, they're supposed to then potentially figure out whether or not I also have an immigration status problem based on a reasonable suspicion. Now, how you can have a reasonable suspicion that they violated immigration status other than racial profiling is extremely difficult.
So that would be a very hard thing to determine under normal circumstances unless
there's been a lot of training, and let's face it, Border Patrol receives a lot of training regarding that issue and not crossing the line into discrimination. And that's hard enough for them, and they specialize in that area. I think it takes away our resources that are scarce for other kinds of law enforcement, like protecting the public.
So most of the kinds of things that a police officer might face in that situation would be civil issues, and very few of those people it would be a civil issue, a violation,
Right.
unless they had entered illegally.
Without inspection.
Right, yeah.
Then there would
right.
be that misdemeanor
Right,
exposure.
yeah. Okay, so I see that. What about our former superintendent of schools in El Paso, Lorenzo Garcia, and the photographing of potential students coming across the bridge and so forth? Can you enlighten us a little bit about what they were doing exactly and whether this was a good or a bad thing?
What I've heard is what's in the newspaper, and what I've heard is that for a few days, I'm not sure how many, that apparently a few people were tasked with taking photographs of children coming into the United States. What they were trying to assess is whether or not, in declaring that I'm a resident of the particular school district, whether or not my declaration was factual or not. The concern was they were actually trying to figure out immigration status of the students. That really wasn't, from what I understand, what was going on. As we know, there's a Supreme Court case out there that started in Texas, Plyler v. Doe, which basically established that your schools, public schools, cannot question or prohibit students from attending based on immigration status. So you have this very confusing situation for foreign nationals coming to the United States because they think, well, nobody asked me. What do you mean I had to have a visa to be able to attend school? But that is indeed the case. To attend private schools, I have to have a visa when we're talking K through 12. The same thing with public schools. But you can't get a visa to attend a public school other than for 1 year, and you have to reimburse the tuition costs. So we have very stringent requirements on visas to be able to be a student in the United States, and yet we also can't ask about it.
And so what's the fair and just thing to do from the standpoint of the taxpayer who's funding the schools and the people who want to flee a bad educational system, perhaps in what is, as we know there?
Well, I mean, if we want to go ahead and say to attend when you are not a resident in our district, which is the policy we have, if you want to attend, you're not a resident in our district, normally we have a tuition requirement. Perhaps the middle ground is saying if you are indeed a foreign national not entitled to live in the United States, but you're here anyway, and we can't report this to anyone, nor are we required to for enforcement purposes, that we would, do a tuition solution to that question.
Yeah. Now, a number of the schools require, well, when you register, you have to show the water bill or the utility bill, and you have to, quote unquote, prove residency. So the students so what they were trying to do was question whether the documentation that students were showing was legitimate, and go one step further to verify whether they were residents or not. Is that kind of what was happening?
You're right.
Yeah, and kind of an interesting way to do it, but I don't know whether were they effective at doing it, or I read the articles in the paper, but they didn't talk about the results. I don't know whether you know either.
No, I don't know. I mean, I from what I read, they really didn't feel like it had helped them that much in figuring that out.
Right, yeah. In the next 100 years, it's a book by George Friedman. He says that we're actually going to be paying immigrants to come here as a result of just the whole population issue and the decline of
talent.
Yeah, and decline of birth rate. So do you think that's really true? At what point are we going to get there, and why aren't we preparing for that right now in the policies that we have?
Well, there's a Bloomberg study out. It's a Partnership for a New Economy, and it's a very interesting study about how desperate we're going to be for competing for the best and the brightest. Federal Reserve study as well, same thing. We have an aging population. We need replenishment. We're all going to be competing for the same people. We need to get out there and be as competitive as we possibly can. Canada, in the past, month, they have announced a new startup visa trying to encourage easier investment opportunities in Canada and gaining permanent resident status in Canada. We really need to get with the program and stop arguing over this, because we don't have time to be put back further in line of being competitive globally for talent.
Right.
What is it? The highest number, let's see, the patents that are filed in this country, predominantly foreign nationals.
Yeah. So it really is to our advantage to get with it, as you say, and deal with the immigration issue based on what the real needs are, both now and in the future.
Agreed.
And I think as Christians, we can not only be compassionate, but we can also know that we're doing the best thing for our country, that it's actually going to benefit our future and our children and our grandchildren to have a fair and just and generous immigration policy.
I
that
agree.
what you're thinking?
And Christians, as well as other denominations,
Yeah,
have provided great leadership in this area of compassion and justice. I can't speak anymore. And I think it's exemplary leadership that they've provided in this area.
Okay. All right. Well, again, we're out of time. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your insights, Kathleen. And once again, immigration is such a big issue. I hope that you have been enlightened as much as I have in this discussion about the complex issues related to immigration, but there are solutions. And we need to be praying for the resolution of the immigration problem, both for individuals and for our country's sake. Thank you so much for watching.